Hey everyone, Skeletor here again. We're going to be doing an updated Warcraft logs plus WoW Analyzer video about how to go over your logs. Last time I made one was during the pre-patch. A little bit has changed since then, so this is a good time now, since we're a little bit further into the first tier rating, to go over a few things. So just to start here, I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant. If you don't want to hear the rant, I will put a timestamp down below to where the analyzation starts on what I do. But a lot of times what you'll see is when people talking in other Discords or even help channels that are WoW related, of course, they'll be talking about their logs. And they'll be talking about how they got an orange parse, or they got a purple parse, or they're getting a blue parse. And sometimes you'll see they're talking about their eye level parse. So there's the overall parse you can get, then there's the item level parse. Some people, mostly newer players, they like to stick to that item level parse because they believe it's a better representation of their performance. And what I'm here to say is that it's not. And I'm also saying that overall percentage is also not. The best way to judge your own performance is to look at your logs. Now, getting parses and getting orange parses, that's great and all. It's fun. People enjoy that aspect. I enjoy that. But a parse isn't necessarily indicative of your performance. The best way to judge your own performance is to actually look at your performance. So part of this is going over logs, in this case just for Rep Paladin, about how you can judge your own performance. And for the example here, I usually use mythic logs, but I'm going to use a heroic log today. Why heroic versus mythic? Because a lot of people, when they talk about logs, they mainly talk about heroic, even though if you're in a class Discord, mythic rating might be a more common discussion. Lots of people on other forums, such as MMOChamp or Reddit, or the WoW forums, they tend to refer to their heroic logs. And heroic logs, in my opinion, they carry a lot less weight than mythic logs. And that's due to a number of reasons. One, in heroic, the amount of people that raid heroic versus the amount of people that raid mythic is massive. So as an example, if you look at Talic on heroic, there's over 25,000 guilds that have killed Talic on heroic. And if you compare that to mythic Talic is about 10,000. So less than half of the number of guilds have killed mythic Talic. Which means that the number of parses or logs that you compare against is a lot less. So there is a larger difference in between the percentages. So in heroic, you could not do great in your performance overall, but you can still get a good parse, like a purple or orange parse. So what we're going to do here today, we're going to use this log. This is a random log, and we're going to go over casks here, who got a 95% for the last 2 weeks. So you might look at that and say, hey, 95%, I did pretty good here. There's nothing I need to do. I'm playing my class right. But like I'm saying, that's not always the case. Not to pick on this guy here, but he's our example. So we'll jump into his performance, and we'll see what he did right, what he did wrong, and go from there. So first thing I'll do here is we'll click on his name, we'll bring him up, and we're going to cover some of the basics first before jumping into the log. We'll go to the summary tab here, we'll see his talents. His talent setup is pretty standard for 99% of people. This will be the highest simming setup, which is Righteous Verdict, Hammer, Wrath, Wake of Ashes, and Inquisition. That is common. You can see his Azerite powers. His Azerite powers are pretty good. But again, Azerite, not a huge influence. I'm just mentioning they're pretty good traits overall. You can see his gear here. You can see that he has his gems in. You can see he has his enchants. All that's good. And also we use WoW Analyzer. WoW Analyzer will cover that as well. You go to WoW Analyzer, go to Be Well Prepared. It'll show like all items enchanted, use high quality enchants, things of that nature. You can also go to the character tab and see it here. You can mouse over it, you'll see he has the max level enchants and he has the gems in his gear. That's good. A lot of people, when they try to get help, they don't link their logs first. They ask about their stats or their gear. They ask if their stats or their gear is the reason their DPS is not good. And 99.9% of the time, it's not the reason. The reason that your DPS is not good is because you are not performing as well as you could be. That's what it boils down to, plain and simple. Not trying to sound like an asshole here, but that's how it is. But here, his gear is pretty good, regardless. So, no complaints there. He shouldn't have any complaints about his gear that someone has better gear than him. He has very good gear. What I also do is I'll open up in the armory, I'll check it out here. We can see since then he got a new weapon, so good for him. He got the Mythic Mace off Talek. One thing I'll also do is I'll bring up raid bots and I'll have their character simmed. I'm using Talek because Talek is a simple fight. You can sim for it pretty decently. All you really have to do is just adjust the fight length. And we can see here that the fight was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. We can just go over to raid bots. We'll change the fight length just to 4 minutes. And we'll just run that. We'll leave the raid buffs on. In his fight, he does have every raid buff, so none of them are missing. So you can adjust those if you need to. If you used augmentation, you can disable it or leave it enabled. Flask, if you used it or didn't use it, you can adjust these options to customize it a bit more to your character. Now, this isn't a perfect representation. This is just an approximation. And it's also a sim. You shouldn't expect to hit your sim DPS. It's not going to happen. If it does happen, that's a very rare occurrence. And it's going to be more in terms of that RNG was well in your favor. Or a lot of people died and you got a lot of rep procs. But we'll run the sim. We'll get an idea of what the higher end of his damage could be. That'll just take a moment here for me. So we can see here this is 16,300 DPS. Bear in mind, he's also using a different talent setup. He's not using what he was in Raid. So you'd want to change that. He also has a new weapon here. So that'll, again, affect the DPS a little bit. But we'll just call it a flat 16,000 would be on the high end of what we could expect. And on him, we go to damage done. He was at 13,300. So a few thousand off, and let's see why that is. So we covered talents already. He had the right talents. What I'll do if someone is using talents that aren't the best setup, I will change their talents in the sim, and I'll see how much better their talents could be. That's very easy now on raid bots. You go to the raid bots homepage. You go to top gear. You paste in your string. And scroll down. We've got a talent build. And you can sim different talent builds. It's very easy. You just click on the talents. If you wanted to sim every talent combo, you can do that. You just choose them all the DPS ones. And there's 81 different possible builds for DPS. It also lets you sim enchants and gems too. It does make those iterations go high quite fast. So if you're just doing a talent sim, definitely turn those off. And you'll see the sim is much more reasonable now, that even people without premium can run this sim. So you can do that, you can do your talent compare, and you can see what talents are good for you. But again, his talents were appropriate for him. They were optimal. His gear is good. His gear is optimal. So first thing we'll cover here is consumables. So we can either use the log to check it from the buffs. You can go to buffs here. We can see a battle potion of strength. There is 2 of those. So he got his pre-pot and his pot later in the fight. We scroll down a bit further. Not all these are categorized yet. So they're under raid buffs actually now, not uncategorized. You got a food buff there. Some of the class buffs, like Battle Shout, Arcane Intellect, and Fortitude. He's got his flask on. He's got a rune on. So he has everything. He's not missing any consumables. And consumables, especially potions and flask, can make up a good amount of your DPS. And if you want to know how much of your DPS it makes up, just go to raid bots. Go to a quick sim. And again, you can change your potion here. You can run a sim with no potion. and take a look and see how much less your DPS is. If you don't use food, do no food. If you don't use a flask, change no flask. And you can customize this. You can get a better idea of how much more DPS you could be doing if you were using better potions or using better food or using them in general. It's very easy to do. But here, his consumables are all good. So the first thing we'll jump into here is his opener, which you can do from Warcraft logs here. You'll go to timelines, you'll go to casts. So we can see he went Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike, Inquisition, Judgment, then Wings. Now this is not the optimal opener. I can tell you that right away. But also in WoW Analyzer, we can also see this easily. From WoW Analyzer, we scroll down to cooldowns, and we can see his first Avenging Wrath here. That's one way to see it. It won't show before that, so you can use timeline, the same as Warcraft logs, and look at the timeline and see what was going on. So for this standard talent setup, the opener is Blade of Justice, Judgment, Inquisition, Wings, then Wake, which we can see here. He didn't do that, and his Wake was delayed quite a bit. He didn't use Wake until 19 seconds into the fight. You definitely don't want to delay Wake that long. So again, if you want a reference for openers, you can use my guide. I'll put a link below, of course. There's a table of contents. Look in the table of contents. There's openers here. Go to the opener section, find your opener. So that's an easy fix. Now, fixing your opener doesn't fix your DPS overall. It's just one of the more simple things you can do. Getting your opener right is a very easy first step to improving your DPS. Now, in this case, this was using Avenging Wrath. Some people do use Crusade. Contrary to the popular belief, Crusade is not a dead talent. Crusade is perfectly viable, and right now, for some people, it does sim better than Divine Purpose. It usually comes in as the second best talent behind Inquisition. If you use Crusade, the opener is a lot more important with Crusade, so you'll definitely want to refer to my guide there, or any other guide if you want to, but obviously I have a guide, so I'm going to say use mine. So Crusade, those are covered in my guide. Check those openers out. Make sure your opener is proper. Because Crusade, you have to build up your stacks to have more haste and do more damage, so it's very important to optimize that. Right, also with his opener here, he's using Hammer of Wrath. So we got a few casts of Hammer of Wrath here. We can see that he got 3 of them inside of his window with his opener. There was no bloodlust at the start of the fight from earlier when I looked at the graph here. You can see this blue section is when Lust was used. And depending on your haste amount in your opener, you can get 3 to 4 Hammer Wraths on average without Bloodlust. Getting that 4th hammer requires at least 20% haste on your character. And based on his opener here, I would expect him to get 3 if he did his opener proper with the Wake of Ashes coming first. But because he used such a weird opener, he could have actually fit 4 hammers into his opener here. We can see here, he used his Blade of Wrath, or Blade of Justice, before his Hammer of Wrath. So he went Blade, Templar's Verdict, then Hammer. So he was only at 4 holy power here. He could have done a Hammer first, instead of the Templar's Verdict. Or he could have used his hammer earlier, and there might have been enough wiggle room there for him to fit 4 hammers in. So just a very small note there. The second general thing that we'll go over here is holy power usage. This is one of the biggest issues that we all see. In holy power usage, you definitely want to use WoW Analyzer and Warcraft logs together. So for Warcraft log, go to resources, change it to holy power, go to tables here. Tables is the general overview. This will match up with WoW Analyzer. And what we can see right away is that there is 4 wasted from Blade, 1 wasted from Crusade, or sorry, Crusader Strike, 4 wasted from Wake, and 2 from Judgment. So right away, Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike, and Judgment should all be 0. You should never waste Holy Power with those abilities. So right away, that's 7 Holy Power wasted just from that. So he's missing out on 2 Templar's Verdicts there. That's damage lost in terms of Templar's Verdict, and in terms of talents if he's using Righteous Verdict, which he is. So that's definitely something to watch out for. Make sure your Holy Power bar is visible on your screen, and that you don't overcap. Now, Wake of Ashes, he had 4 waste there. With Wake of Ashes, sometimes it's okay to waste Holy Power, and the best way to look at it is to go to Warcraft logs here. We're going to switch from tables to events. And we'll look through here. When there is Holy Power waste, as we scroll down, we'll see it here as O. O for over or overage. So wasted 1 from Blade, 1 from Judgment, 2 from Blade, 2 from Wake. So here the first is Wake, wasted 2. You should never waste 2 with Wake. So we'll scroll down some more. Wake again, 2 from Wake. So all 4 of his waste was from Wake. So that's not good. When you have 2 Holy Power, you should build 1 more and then spend, and then Wake. Now, if you have 1 Holy Power and you're not sure if you should Wake or not, you should refer to my guide. I mentioned it there. But to let you know is that if you have 1 Holy Power and your Blade of Justice is on cooldown for more than 1 GCD, it's okay to Wake. But if your Blade of Justice is about to be up in less than a second, or it's already up, you should use your Blade first, and then you should use a spender, and then you should Wake. So you never want to waste 2 with Wake of Ashes, or more. It's very bad. Only 1, and only in some scenarios. And one thing we can see here is that some of this waste was in line with each other. So we can see that timestamp of 152. We can go back to WoW Analyzer here, go to the timeline. We can scroll over to 152. And you can see his Blade of Justice, or sorry, his Judgment was a waste of 1. So we can see here he wasted that 1 there. He's already at 5. He hits Blade. So again, 2 Holy Power that is gone. And then he does follow up with his TVs finally. Or with a TV. And then he wakes. And that Wake wastes 2. And we can see here is that his Crusader Strike is not on cooldown. When it's on cooldown, you'll see the bar here. The nice thing about WoW Analyzer is having this bar to show the remaining cooldown of your abilities. So we know he could have pressed Crusader Strike and then had another Templar's Verdict, and then he could have used a Wake. Alright, so the next biggest issue here that I like to go over is Inquisition. If you pick Inquisition, you have to use it properly. There's not a very large amount of damage between Crusade, Divine Purpose, or Inquisition. So if you pick Inquisition, you have to use it perfectly, which isn't hard to do. But if you are new to Ret, or new to the talent, you do have to remember to use it. WoW Analyzer is very nice here. It'll show you your damage general buffed. And we can see here that 80% of his damage was buffed by Inquisition, which is very low. For this, it is possible to have 99% of your damage buffed by Inquisition, and you should always aim to have that 99%. And also on WoW Analyzer, there's a new feature here. We'll go to the start. When you use Inquisition, you'll get a buff duration here. Now you'll see it says 90 seconds, and that's because his casts were chained. So we can see Inquisition was used there. We scroll over. We can see it was used before it fell off, which is good. And we can scroll over, and we can see here his Inquisition falls off right here. And then he starts to use some of his abilities without Inquisition. So this is all lost damage. You can even see there he used Awake, and Wake is a big part of our damage. And it was not benefiting him in any way. So you want to make sure to keep that buff active. So there's a very large period of time there. So he got Inquisition back around 223. It fell off at 134. So he had about 50 seconds of downtime there. That's a huge gap. You can see here there's a small gap here. He could have refreshed it early to avoid a small gap. We'll scroll over a bit more. And at the end of the fight, again, a gap of some damage here. So for Inquisition usage, this is also covered in my guide, but the way Inquisition works is that when you use 3 Holy Power, you get 45 seconds of that buff. And you can refresh Inquisition early. So if your Inquisition has 13 seconds or less remaining, if you use Inquisition again at 3 Holy Power, you can extend that buff past 45 seconds. It'll actually be 58 seconds total. It's called Pandemic, which was added in MoP as a mechanic for Warlocks that they adjusted to other specs that have buffs in some cases. And if you reference my guide, it does mention Inquisition usage, about how you should use it. It also has some further considerations about it. So mainly, you want to use Inquisition when it's down. Obviously, it's the first priority. So at the start of the fight, get it up right away. While your Inquisition has less than 13 seconds remaining, is when you'll want to recast it. Ideally, lower the better. If you can recast it when there's 1 second left on the buff, that's better in most scenarios. Now, what can happen though is you'll find that your Avenging Wrath is coming off cooldown, and your Inquisition is about to fall off. And one of the most important things to do is to make sure that you do not refresh your Inquisition during your wings, and also making sure your Inquisition doesn't fall off during wings. So what we have here is if Inquisition is at or below 20 seconds remaining, and the cooldown of Avenging Wrath is less than 15 seconds, you can refresh Inquisition with 3 Holy Power, and that will avoid you having to refresh it during wings or having it run out. So this is one scenario where we will actually refresh it before that pandemic range, but it's okay in this case because we want to make sure it's up. And that's the most important aspect. So again, with Inquisition, with such a low benefit of only 80%, he would have done more damage using either Crusade or Divine Purpose. But the best thing you can do is get a weak aura, go to wago.io, find an Inquisition weak aura that you like, or make one yourself, and keep track of it. Now what we can do here is we can break down the general rotation a bit. We'll use the timeline here. I prefer this view to Warcraft logs. We scroll up here. For the reason being that it has the cooldown information. So again, we covered his opener. The opener was not ideal. We can see here that his wake was very delayed. You don't want to delay your Wake of Ashes. So we'll focus on that one here. So he used Wake. It came off cooldown. He used it again relatively fast. That's alright. Again, he used it pretty soon. That's good. We see here, there is a bit of a larger gap here of more than 10 seconds. Generally, you're not going to delay your Wake of Ashes unless there's a wave of ads spawning, such as on Zekvaz. But this was on Talic, so on Talic, you wouldn't want to delay that. You would want to use it. We'll scroll down a bit further. we have another large gap here of nearly 10 seconds. Again, that's too long. You should be using your Wake of Ashes within a few GCDs when it comes back. So first tip there is make sure to not delay your wake, unless you have a specific reason for delaying it, such as the ads on Zekvos or something similar. Now, if we look in general, a very basic priority is that Blade of Justice has priority over Judgment, and Judgment has priority over Hammer of Wrath, and Hammer of Wrath has priority over Crusader Strike. So right away he used that Crusader Strike, which again, you don't want to prioritize that if your other builders are available and you want overcap. So Judgment would have been a better use there. It's important to keep our main abilities on cooldown, our main abilities being Judgment and Blade. So if we scroll down here, we can see here again, there was a case here where he did prioritize his Crusader Strike over his Blade, which you wouldn't want to do. And you just scroll along the line here. Sometimes you'll see the cooldown was much shorter, and that's because Art of War procced or Blade of Wrath procced. So sometimes you will have a shorter cooldown, which is normal. But you want to make sure you're prioritizing your Blade and your Judgment. We got here another case where Judgment was prioritized over Blade, so you would have want to use Blade first. It was available, it wasn't on cooldown. Another case here, again, you want to move that Blade before the Judgment. That was good there. Looking pretty good here. Here's a case where it was used after. So again, be careful with that. And just scroll through the timeline. I'm not going to go over the entire thing. This is pretty... I feel like I went over it good enough here for the video, but for yourself, definitely take the time, go over it, and see where you prioritized something that you shouldn't have. Like in this case, using Judgment over Blade. Very easy to do. You scroll through, you look at it, you get a general idea. It looks a bit intimidating at first, but after you look at a few logs, it'll get more comfortable to do, and it gets easier to do. Alright, so some other common rotation mistakes is using Divine Storm at inappropriate times. A lot of times you'll see people use Divine Storm on 2 targets, which you do not do anymore. For Divine Storm, generally speaking, you will use it when there are 3 or more targets. The only time you would use Divine Storm on 2 targets, or even 1 target, is if you have the Divine Right Azerite trait, which is the one where when you use Divine Storm on a mob below 20% health, it gives you a strength buff for 15 seconds, and you will only use that once every 15 seconds on that execute range mob to keep the buff up. You won't be spamming it, so it's a very limited use. So generally, you only use Divine Storm when there's 3 or more targets. So one thing that we see missing here is a racial ability. So we can double check his race from the character here. He is a Blood Elf. And as a Blood Elf, we have Arcane Torrent. Arcane Torrent is a great tool for us. It has a 1.5 minute cooldown, so we can use it a few times a fight. And what it does, it gives us 1 holy power. So we can use that to fill in some of our downtime. And we can see based off his casts that he had here, he never used his Arcane Torrent. So, and based on how long the fight is, he could have got 2 to 3 uses of it pretty easily. So again, take advantage of your racial abilities. So Blood Elves have Arcane Torrent. If you're a Lightforged Draenei, you have your Light's Judgment. which you generally use on cooldown or save for a large pack of mobs if needed. And also, Dark Iron Dwarf has their Fire Blood for the strength buff. And for that one, you'll use that during your wings. It's only an 8-second buff, and it has a 2-minute cooldown, just like wings. So with Avenging Wrath, you'll pop it with your wings and your trinkets if you have a on-use trinket. And if you're using Crusade, you only want to use it once you have 10 stacks of Crusade. So make use of your racial abilities if you have them available to you. So next thing I like to go over here is downtime. So we're at 23.54% downtime there. That is a little bit more than I would expect for heroic Talic. On Talic, I would generally expect someone to be below 20%. And a good way to look at the gaps is to use Warcraft logs. And we see here that we have this little table. In the gaps, those are gaps in the rotation, but right now we don't have them all turned on. As long as I can tell bars at the moment. Come on. Okay, it's being a little bit of a pest here, so we'll have to check all of them. We'll stick to the damage abilities. We don't need that. We'll leave melee off for now. So again, a couple small gaps there. In general, you would expect those small gaps to be either movement, such as dropping a debuff out. And on Heroic Talic, the only debuff we have to worry about really is during the first phase and the last phase, when he puts the plasma discharge on you. And as a paladin, you can use Divine Shield to remove that. But what we can also do is auto attacks are a big portion of our damage. So we'll uncheck everything here and we'll leave only auto attacks or melee available. If you don't see melee as an option, make sure to click on melee there. So we can see here we have some large gaps of no auto attacks. Now this is the elevator phase. As we can see, he's hitting some bloods. So on the elevator phase, we'll have a bit more downtime if the mobs die. But still, we're getting some gaps there. And what I want to do is I'll want to go check his debuffs. And we'll see if he had a debuff that required him to run out to lose downtime. So we'll go to debuffs here. He had a Fixate, which doesn't do anything. He has Forbearance, which is from using Bubble. Bloodstorm, which is just a ground effect, and Sated from Bloodlust. So he had no debuffs to run out for. So there was times there where he wasn't on the boss for whatever reason, where he was losing uptime. So you want to limit your downtime on the boss as much as possible. And again, that's just from the casts. And you can choose your abilities there. By default, it does Temple Verdict. But just turn on your other abilities and it will fill them in. Or if you don't want all the abilities, again, we want melee. Melee is not there. We'll click on melee. We'll select melee again. And we can see the auto attack uptime. So uptime and downtime, an important issue. We want to minimize our downtime. We are a cooldown based class with our abilities, our generators having a cooldown. So we want to make sure the cooldowns are always rolling. And if we're out of range on the target or just not pressing our buttons, that negatively impacts our DPS. So always make sure your cooldowns are rolling. Alright, another hot topic and discussion about Ret is Righteous Verdict. Thanks to the WoW Analyzer here, we have this. This is the Righteous Verdict icon. You mouse over it, it'll tell you. It's when do you use Righteous Verdict and when do you use Zeal? And the answer is it depends. So if we look here, he used Righteous Verdict. we mouse over the number, he had 78% of his cast were buffed, and his total damage was 3.8%. Or that's the number, that's how much of his Templar's Verdict, or that's how much damage he gained from the talent, was 3.8% of his DPS. Now, if we look at a simulation, if you compare how much DPS Zeal provides versus how much DPS Righteous Verdict provides, on average, Zeal is about 4%, or a little short of 4% of your DPS in a sim, and Righteous Verdict is usually 5% or a bit more. So being at 3.8% here, that's actually a little bit low. At this amount of buff damage, he possibly could have benefited from using Zeal over Righteous Verdict in terms of pure DPS output. So if pure DPS output is your concern, you want to make sure when you use Righteous Verdict that your Righteous Verdict is doing 4% or more of your damage as a rule of thumb. If it's doing less than 4% of your damage and you're going for pure damage, you either might want to switch to Zeal, or you might want to go over your rotation to make sure it's being done properly. There is nothing special in the rotation for Righteous Verdict. You don't use Templar's Verdict early to keep the buff rolling if your cooldowns are up for Blade and Judgment. So do not modify your rotation in any way for Righteous Verdict. If you try to do that, you'll end up actually getting a lower downtime from this talent, because you'll be leaving your generators on cooldown, and you're losing potential uses of them later in the fight by delaying them. So that works against you. Now, haste doesn't really affect the total damage output of this talent, because it does last for 6 seconds. The only benefit that haste will give you is if you have 50% haste, you can get one more global inside that window. But that really only happens during Bloodlust or Crusade. On average, you shouldn't expect to have that much haste, so it's a non-issue. So for most people, on average, 5% damage benefit from Righteous Verdict is in a sim. You want to be at 4% or higher to be competitive with Zeal, because Zeal does about 4% or just shy of 4%. Now, the other way to look at it is, okay, is it a fight that has priority targets? So, a good example of that could be Zek Vaz. Zek Vaz has the 3 ads that spawn in that little triangle formation. Those are priority targets. On Fetid Devourer, there's the Mutated Mass and also the Corpuscles that spawn. Those are priority targets. So things like that, where you are mainly on Zek Vaz. Zek Vaz also spawns a large wave of ads, so you'll be using Divine Storm a few times. And using Divine Storm does not mean that you will switch to Zeal right away. Casting 1, 2, 3 Divine Storms is not going to tank the value of Righteous Verdict enough that you should use Zeal in all cases. So again, if it's a fight like Zek Vaz, put yourself in the analyzer here and see if your Righteous Verdict does 4% or more for total damage. But if you care about priority target damage, Righteous Verdict is better than Zeal at priority target damage. So when you're killing those Spellbinder ads on Zek Vaz, you'll be doing a single target rotation. And if you want, or as well on Fetid Devourer, if you're hitting that Corpuscle, it has to die before it gets eaten. You want to do as much damage as possible in that short window. And in cases of short windows where damage is important, Righteous Verdict will be a better choice than Zeal. It might be less overall damage, but the damage you're doing at an important time will far outweigh the benefit of having higher damage overall, especially on progression. On progression, you shouldn't be trying to cheese logs to do the most damage. you should be doing what you need to do to make sure the boss dies. So one thing I mentioned here with the rotation is downtime. By default, on WoW Analyzer, there's a checklist here called Always Be Casting. This is the first option. It'll show you the downtime. And get some more information, there's use core abilities as often as possible. And we can see this here. What you should expect is Blade, Justice, and Judgment should always have a green bar. If your usage isn't green for those two spells, there's a mistake. In most cases, on some fights, if there is large amounts of downtime, you can't really help it. If you have to run across the room to get to an ad, if you're not casting, you'll obviously lose some downtime there. Or in a fight like Gahun, where you're waiting for the next phase to start, there's just some downtime you can't avoid. And the analyzer doesn't account for that. But on a fight like Talic, though, there's pretty much no downtime. The only downtime is either from a debuff or from the elevator phase if the ads die very fast. But in this case, it wasn't an issue with him. It was just an issue of his judgment was not used enough relatively to his other abilities. Now, Crusader Strike is a bit variable. It depends on the fight. Sometimes you might have a lower amount used because of RNG with Blade. Or if you're using a talent like Hammer or Wrath where it fills in some of those globals. That Hammer or Wrath usage is more important than Crusader Strike, so that will lower the overall amount used. But in general, you want to make sure your Blade and your Judgment are being used as much as possible without overcapping. So he was a bit low on the Judgment side here. And the last thing I really want to go over is Shield of Vengeance. And on WoW Analyzer here, we have a nice little tool. It'll show you how much of your Shield of Vengeance was absorbed. So again, Shield of Vengeance is a pseudo-defensive. It's mostly used as an offensive spell, though. It creates an absorb for 30% of your max health. It's also affected by versatility only. Nothing else affects it, just your health. Your max health and versatility. And the goal is to have it absorb as much damage as possible, so it does as much damage as possible. On a fight like Talic, it's very easy to make it explode. On Heroic, you can stand in those his little pulse he does with those 3 red lines that go out. You can stand in those. If you chase him down on Heroic, when he throws his gavel, you can pop it there. If you stand in those blood pools next to the boss, if they spawn there, it'll pop the Shield of Vengeance there. It's a pretty forgiving fight to use it on. So make sure, when you can technically, you abuse it, really. It's not very good gameplay. Monks have the same issue with their Touch of Karma, but it is worse for them because it is such a large portion of their damage. But even for Ret, we can expect Shield of Vengeance to be 3 to 4% of our damage if we use it as much as possible. So it's really minor overall, but it's just one thing that you can do to make the usage a bit better. And on my guide, I do cover some of the bosses. If we go here, it's not on the main guide here, but at the top of the page, under guides, I have a couple of them here. We have a Mythic Uldir Ret Paladin Quick Tips. I don't have all the bosses filled in yet. I need to fill in a few more. I can definitely fill in Fetid and Zeal here soon. But I'll mention examples where you can use your abilities a bit more effectively. Like when you can use Divine Shield to avoid certain issues. When you can use Shield of Vengeance to do some extra damage. So make use of that. And also in the Discord, if you're in the Hammer Wrath Discord, which you should be, there's a questions channel. Make sure to ask questions there. You can always ask questions on the video here as well. And that pretty much covers it. If you do think of something that wasn't covered enough, or you want more information on, If you feel that something was missed, just make sure to let me know. But other than that, this is the overview of how you should analyze your logs and why, when it comes to percentages in logs, they don't matter. If you want to know how well you did, you don't rely on percent, you rely on your own analysis of your performance. We have tools like Warcraft Logs and WoW Analyzer here that'll let you really drill down on what you can do better to do more damage. But thank you for watching and have a good day.